delighted to have you all with us today for the launch of the Stronger Foundation's investment report. This is the 5th out of 6 reports in the series, and we're delighted to be joined by Danielle Walker Palmour, who chaired the working group and who's also the director of the Friends Provident Foundation. And we're also delighted to be joined by Matthew Whittell, who is the head of finance and resources at the Ellerman Foundation. We will be recording the webinar today to make it available for ACF members who aren't able to be online. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm just letting the participant numbers click up again. There we go. So I'm Gail Cunningham, I'll be your chair today, and I head ACF's Investment Learning Programme. We also have my colleague Rachel, who is your technical host for today. If you have any queries, please do reach out via the chat function, and Rachel will do her best to help you. A few quick housekeeping rules. As always with investment things, we need to do the legal part first. So foundations should seek their own financial and legal advice before making investment decisions, and we are not offering any financial or legal advice today. In terms of the Zoom functionality itself, please do start submitting your questions via the Q&A function you can see at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to say something with your question and voice your own question, then please indicate that when you put your question. If you'd prefer me to ask your question, then that's absolutely fine. Please do keep those questions coming through in the Q&A. Otherwise, you'll have Danielle, Matthew and I chatting about what we're having for lunch. We do also have the chat function that you can use. If you put your message to all panelists, then Rachel will be able to see that and she'll be able to help you with any issues that you have. If you are struggling, you can reach out to Rachel via email, rachel@acf.org.uk. If at any point you're struggling to see the slides or you have my face blocking the slides, then just click on them and move them to the side, and then I'll stop blocking them for you. And the final thing to say is, as always, there is no such thing as a stupid question. Please do keep your questions coming through. The more questions we have, the more interactive it will be. So we're going to start off with some polls today. Rachel's just going to pop the polls up there now. This is just to wake you up at the beginning of the session. So if you can just take a couple of seconds to fill that in. Where are you joining from today? What size of foundation are you? And we're using the grants size as a proxy for size. And then are you a member of staff or a trustee? So if we can see what everybody's voting for there. Of voting. We're still letting the votes come in. Last chance to vote. Brilliant. So if we end that poll. So a majority of people from England, but we do have some colleagues in Scotland and Wales, so it's great to have you there. What size of foundation? A fairly even split, with the majority of you having a grant expenditure of somewhere between 500,000 and 5 million. And members of staff and trustees, we've got about 2/3 staff members and 1/3 trustees. So it's really great to have all of you on the call today. Moving on to the next slide of what is the Stronger Foundations Initiative. We have 80 people on the call today. And we know that amongst those, there's about 30 trustees, 20 finance and investment directors, and 20 directors or CEOs. Bear in mind when asking questions, not everyone on the call is a foundation. So if you are sharing your experiences, do just bear that in mind. Of the people on the call today, just over half had no prior involvement in the Stronger Foundations Initiative. So I'll give you a little bit of background and bear with me if you have been heavily involved. Stronger Foundations is a flagship project for ACF to help charitable foundations identify and pursue excellent practice. There was an 18-month discovery phase with 6 working groups made up of over 100 foundation representatives from our members, and we heard from over 50 external speakers across the 6 groups, including some provocation. It is, to our knowledge, the largest foundation engagement initiative globally to date, and it's becoming a template for ACF's equivalent organisations across Europe, North America and Australasia. As well as the 6 themes that were explored, what we're starting to see is some cross-cutting themes emerging as we look at the different reports and what's come out. The first is power, who holds it, how they hold it, and how they share it. And clearly there's debates ongoing in that one. Accountability, some would argue that foundations lack accountability. Others would say that the lack of accountability is the foundation's greatest asset, to have independence of activity. So ongoing debate on that one as well. Legitimacy, discussions, there were a lot of discussions around how to involve stakeholders and very pertinent discussions about transparency. And then legacy, and we talk about in the investment report the short, medium and long-term horizons, in fact including sometimes perpetuity, that foundations are dealing with. And also foundations have been grappling with how to secure impact regardless of their time horizon. The other thing we're starting to see emerging from across the reports is a bit of a hierarchy of foundation practice in terms of what foundations are doing. At level 1, it's where all of a foundation's behaviours, activities and decision making are intentional, they've been thought about and can be explained. We're then seeing some foundations where they're putting all of their resources towards the impact and the social good that they're trying to achieve. So that could be their internal processes, their decision making, their recruitment, their investments and so on. And then we're seeing this third level where all of the foundation's resources and behaviours are overtly, so they are publicly and directly aligning to their charitable mission and to the impact that they're wanting to achieve. Naturally, all of these are still open to debate, and we will be putting together some more ACF work on some of these topics going forward. Just to introduce the investment report, which I know was only released yesterday, so some of you will have had a chance to read and others have just had a glance through. As Carol Mack's introduction to the report states, a well-managed investment portfolio is the engine that powers a foundation's activity. Financial returns are of course important to ensure the ongoing viability of the foundation model and to provide resource for grant making and other activity. What the report does also make clear though is that maintaining the value of a foundation's capital is not a charitable purpose nor an end in itself. Investments exist to serve the mission of the foundation. We also note that there are a wide range of resources available to foundations to support them in achieving financial returns from their investments, and that this report has a different focus. It's about looking at how investments can be more closely integrated with the foundation's grant making and other activities. We're also aware, as we're all at home, that we are in the midst of a global pandemic and that the world, including the world of investment, will be quite different going forward. And the report notes this in that what we say is that the pillars of stronger practice aren't so much a journey where you just instigate them and then you get to an end point, but rather it's a process of ongoing engagement and continuous improvement. And as circumstances change and new challenges come along, foundations will need to respond in their own way. I will pause there. Just a quick reminder to do keep the questions coming through on the Q&A, and if you are happy to speak, then please indicate that, or if you'd rather I ask your question, then that's fine as well. On that note, I'm delighted to introduce Danielle Walker Palmour, who is the chair of the Investment Working Group and who is the director of the Friends Provident Foundation. I'm going to hand over to Danielle now, and she's going to talk a little bit about her involvement.
Thanks, Gail. Thank you very much. It's great to see that you were all there. So on this, what is essentially a pretty rainy, miserable day in Yorkshire, but I hope you're having sunnier times wherever you are. Well, as they say, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And I think this exercise in thinking about investments particularly applies. There's so many different contexts in which foundations hold their assets, have assets, don't have assets, that I think even tackling the topic of investment in terms of foundations is quite an exercise. And it was a real privilege to chair the working group of really passionate, intelligent, expert foundation staff who were really thinking over 18 months about how foundation investment practice could be strengthened. And I really take my hat off to all the effort and engagement that the working group showed throughout. So I suppose thinking about the starting point of this exercise such a long time ago, our aim was, at the center of it, was really trying to unpick foundation investment practice. Some of it was to stimulate our thinking and stimulate your thinking as a broader sector, to challenge practice, both in terms of our own practice, but also in terms of yours. You know, what do people do? Why do they do it? And really think about how it could possibly be done better. And at the center of that was also to think about another view. So thinking of the counterfactual. What is another way of looking at it? Why might people not be thinking in quite the way that we're thinking? And we try to maintain that questioning approach throughout the exercise. At the heart of the work was a question of intentionality. Now, part of this links back to a report that ACF published in 2015 by Richard Jenkins and Kate Rogers called Intentional Investing. And it really was a really helpful seminal report in terms of really getting us to think about what do we mean to do with these assets. And we revisited that report and the thinking behind it in the course of our work in terms of, first of all, what does it mean now? But also, what does it mean to us as a group and also singly as foundations? So over the next 18 months, we had a range of speakers. We spoke to each other. We had an amazing video link interview with Larry Kramer, the president of the Hewlett Foundation in the USA, in California. And they have something like $10.8 billion in their endowment, which is a little bit different than most of us. And they give away something like, you know, £500 million in grants every year. So the question about how they manage their endowment was a really fascinating one, because in some ways they were interesting because they are very intentional. Though they are a climate funder, they also do hold fossil fuels. So that we really wanted to get under the skin of how they unpack and think about how they use their endowment and what its function is, and the strengths and weaknesses of their approach. That was really helpful. When we were thinking a little bit more about intentionality, we talked to Richard and Kate again, which was fantastic and really good to exercise and pull apart the ideas in that document. We also had a really good chat with one of our members. Actually, the Access Foundation has a unique approach to using their endowment for impact and really looking and unpacking how impact operates through an endowment. But also thinking about diversity, we had Diana van Maastik from Equalite Foundation in the Netherlands, who is a data provider for gender lens investing. And we also spoke to Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, who are members of our group, about their approach to gender lens investing. And we also talked a bit about how it plays out in racial justice as well. So again, we throughout all of these sessions, and these are just a flavor for some of the things we talked about, was this central question about what's intentional. What is it we mean to do? How can it be operationalized? How can we think about how it can operate in different kinds of contexts that foundations have? So some of the themes that emerged and some of the insights were, so there was a distinct generational difference. It's really clear that newer foundations find the ideas of responsible investing, ethical investing as axiomatic. It's a natural thing. Why wouldn't you use all of your assets in pursuit of your mission? Whereas older foundations found that a little bit more of a journey. And I think it was our aim to try to bridge both of those. Similarly, the question of, you know, there being a conflict between grants and investments was a very strange thought to newer foundations, whereas older foundations were discovering they might have some of those conflicts, and the question was how to resolve them. We also found that there were resource differences. So foundations such as my own actually have investment staff who are engaged in how our investment operates. And many foundations don't have any such staff and anyone who thinks about investment all the time. So those resource differences also made it quite important to think through, how one would operationalize some of these ideas. But I have to say, this report, and I'd like to commend it to you, I think it's a really excellent piece of work. It was pulled together by Sally Boylan and Gail Cunningham and the team at ACF, and they did a really good job in making sense of quite disparate conversations and, lots of different debates. Really brings to the fore this central point, which I think it was very strongly emerged from our discussions, that investment is a key and often neglected part of foundation strategy. Foundations have endowed foundations, most of the bulk of our assets are actually held in our endowments. And it is ridiculous in some ways that we would even consider that we wouldn't strategize. Our strategies for changing society, supporting the arts, housing people who don't have homes. Why wouldn't we use the bulk of our resources in pursuit of that mission? And it's absolutely incumbent upon trustees to be aware and be confident about the use and deployment of those assets in pursuit of mission as much as they are in grants. And we really hope this document is the beginning of that discussion of confidence and learning and engagement with the bulk of your assets. And it is absolutely vital that foundations who do hold assets in the public good are actually using them. We do face existential threats. We, as Gail said, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We have seen what a crisis looks like, and the climate crisis would be not solved by us all going home and staying in. We've really got to think about how we can use our money, the most of it, toward addressing some of these objectives. We need to think about the tools we have, whether mission investing, impact investing, ethical investing. Whatever the answer is, it is important that it is structured into the planning of the foundation regularly. It's not the responsibility of just a few trustees. So this report sets the standard for thinking about and using endowments in terms of strategy. It is a necessary report, but it is not sufficient for bringing about the change we need. That work needs to be done by us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Danielle. Please do, we've got 84 of you on the call now, which is fantastic, but we are yet to get our first question. So you are going to have a long discussion about Matthew and Danielle's lunch. So please do start the questions coming through. I'm going to very quickly now run you through the pillars of stronger practice, which some of you have had a chance to see in the report itself. The first pillar is that a stronger foundation understands that responsibility for its investments sits with each and every member of the trustee board. And we were very careful with this pillar to put in each and every. The legal responsibility is clear, it sits with all trustees, even if it's delegated. What we heard from a lot of foundations was that investments were siloed. So there was one group of trustees discussing investments and another discussing grant making, and that those discussions weren't necessarily being brought together. And what the report sets out is that those trustees with expertise on grant making or other activities can contribute to bigger picture discussions around investment and should be enabled to do so. And also that those with investment expertise should be encouraged to contribute to the foundation's wider work, really bringing those two sides together. The second pillar is that a stronger foundation prioritises its mission when setting its investment objectives. What is clear is that a foundation holds investments in service of its mission. We do also look at how the investment will meet the needs of the mission, both in a financial sense and with regard to the wider social and environmental context. And we are conscious with this pillar that mission may be quite narrowly drawn and that there are wider social and environmental context considerations to be taken into account. Pillar number 3 is that a stronger foundation engages with and holds to account those managing its investments. We are clear that investment expertise is necessary and needs to be valued. whether it comes internally or from external investment managers. What there also needs to be is a structure so that investment expertise can be both heard and challenged, and that measurement can be both around financial returns and wider social and environmental impacts. And what we're really keen to encourage with this pillar is a deep engagement with whoever is managing your investments to identify points of similarity and points of difference, and to examine those for a really deep and engaged relationship. Pillar number 4, a stronger foundation pursues transparency and responds to scrutiny. There are clear internal and external drivers for transparency, including empowering staff, trustees, and wider stakeholders. What we are clear about is that transparency, as set out in the transparency report of Stronger Foundations, is an ongoing journey, and that preparation for transparency can give great learning. So setting the question of, what if we had to report on this? What if we had to talk about that? Can actually be a really useful exercise in and of itself. We also talk about harnessing technology. The data is available. It's about having a process in order to be able to use that data in a way that isn't overwhelming, but also really drills down into the key points that the foundation needs to know about. Moving on to pillar 5, a stronger foundation actively seeks a variety of research to inform its approach to investment. The working group were very keen to explore new approaches and up-to-date investment practice, particularly around responsible, sustainable and impact-driven investing. And there were also a lot of discussions about how diverse voices are heard and how equity of participation can be achieved. So who is involved in investment discussions at the foundation? What is the process to make sure those discussions are equitable and all voices can be heard? And then also looking at what the diversity is within the investment managers that are appointed, where their data is coming from, and they taking on a variety of views, and also looking beyond the usual suspects, looking to academia, to pension funds, to universities, to get learnings for investment practice. Pillar number 6, a stronger foundation reviews its own time horizon. We're very clear that a long time horizon is a key strength of many, many foundations. We're also clear that financial perpetuity is not an end in itself. A long time horizon is an advantage if you can have impact over a long time horizon. We also discuss in this pillar, how does the climate crisis fit into a perpetuity model with this urgent existential threat? Pillar number 7 seeks to positively influence the behaviour of others in relation to investments. And we're looking at the wide range of tools that foundations have. Some may be comfortable using a whole range of tools, some may want to use particular tools in order to look at improvements that might be needed to the financial and regulatory system, and also to share learning and work with others both within and outside the foundation sector. We are now going to run a quick poll just to check everybody's still with us and still awake. So my colleague Rachel will just pop the poll up for us now. And what we'd like you to do is tick as many as apply of which pillars you think really resonate either with you personally or with your foundation at the moment. Brilliant. We're seeing the votes coming in now. Fantastic. We're just giving everyone a chance to read those pillars again. There we go. I think most of you have voted, so I'll just end the polling. So what we're seeing as a clear lead there is pillar number 3 engages with and holds to account those managing its investments. A lot of foundations, clearly that resonates with them. Pillars 1 and 2 also seeing strong resonance, understands that responsibility for its investments sits with each and every member of the trustee board and prioritises its mission when setting its investment objectives. So we're seeing strong engagement across all the pillars there, but particularly on those 3. So I will stop sharing at that point. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker. Just before I do, another reminder, we're seeing some great questions coming through. Please do keep those questions coming through. I'm going to hand over now to Matthew Whittell. Matthew is the Head of Finance and Resources at the Ellerman Foundation. neither Matthew nor the John Ellerman Foundation were involved in the investment working group. So he's coming to this report, as many of you are, with fresh eyes, and he's going to share some of his reflections. Matthew, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, so I've had a little bit longer, but only not much longer, to have a look at this report, and it's extraordinarily timely for us. We have been grappling with some of the issues, hopefully all of the issues set out in the report internally for quite some time, certainly the entire time that I've been at John Ellerman, which is since 2016. And we are making progress. And I think it's fair to say that it's the process of struggling with the issues that is proving to be very helpful internally. And this report arrives just at a point where we are struggling actually to get from an internal navel-gazing position to one where we actually are happy to stand up and say externally what it is we're trying to achieve. And I think that this report is going to catalyse that type of actual decision to get started within our organisation. When I say it's timely, I actually spent the first couple of hours this morning on a Zoom call drafting with my finance committee the final changes to a new investment policy. And it's been very interesting trying to look at where we've got to over the last few years, really ploughing our own furrow with what the report is suggesting we should be doing. And there are very useful, I think it's fair to say, very reassuring areas of overlap, and then areas that are somewhat challenging. I'll give you a very brief summary of our journey to date. It's definitely work in progress. As I say, I arrived at John Ellerman in 2016, and we were very much one of those I found somewhere that was definitely siloed. I didn't know what to expect. It was my first entry into this sector from the commercial sector in climate change mitigation. And the investment side of lived in a different part of the office to the grant making side. And I was immediately struck by the inherent potential for schizophrenia that the investments that I was nominally overseeing could be acting to produce some of the harms that our grant giving activities were seeking to cure. Just to say, John Ellerman makes grants in 3 areas of the arts, the environment, and social action. So across those 3, we do cover quite a broad spectrum. Our mission is really quite broadly drafted. Anyhow, I was naive enough to dare to mention this at a trustee away day, and that caused quite a flutter in the dovecots. If I'd known that it was going to, I wouldn't have dared talk about it, I think. So sometimes naivety is a good thing. And the consequence of that was a board paper written by Gary Steinberg, who's my chair of the finance committee. He's had a long career in the investment sector, notably at the IMF, and he's on the board at Saracen, so he does know his stuff very well. And he produced a paper on mission-related investment in 2017 that kicked things off. We had a tobacco restriction and took the view that that restrictions are quite hard. Tobacco is quite easy because it's quite clear-cut, but as you start to get into other possible restrictions, it's hard to know where to draw the line. And the breadth of our grant-giving activities means that if we were trying to align to mission through restriction, we could end up restricting ourselves from pretty much the entire investable universe if we were purist about it. So we thought that getting better on engagement would be the way to go, and we spent some time trying to learn how to do that, and I think we're getting better at it, but that is very much an ongoing process, and I think it's an ongoing process within the investment management sector as well. They're learning how to respond to us. And with a bit of luck, both the investment managers and the investment owners can work together to push this agenda forward. We have also started to look in more detail at social and impact, or the spectrum that encompasses social and impact investments, and like them in principle and struggle in practice, I think it's fair to say. So through this, we arrived at a point where we had a bit of a muddle of different policies on different parts of the whole, and we thought that we'd better have a better go at bringing it all together in a single document, and have started writing a new investment policy. And we've challenged ourselves by saying we want this to be public, a public-facing document. And that document has now been to my finance committee twice and has been kicked back twice. And we're still drafting it for the next one. But with the encouraging words, I said Gary was at the IMF, and his encouraging words were that he did a similar exercise within the IMF, and the board eventually signed off on an investment policy on draft number 143. So if we can get it done this year, we'll be happy about that. And as I said, our internal discussion has already shown that getting on the journey is at least as important as trying to work out where you want to end up. For our own internal understanding, and to try to help us plot a direction of travel for the near term, rather than trying to perfect the end game before we even get started. So that's our journey. Happy to take questions on that later. I'll just rattle through the pillars, which, as I say, it's not quite real time, but I'm nearly seeing them at the same time as you. And it's been interesting to see how they cut across our own conversations. In order, responsibility of every member of the trustee board. I mean, investments are delegated to our finance committee, who are the experts. But when it comes to something like policy, for governance reasons, we're very clear that the full board needs to sign off on the whole thing. So we're hoping to take this new investment policy to our July board. Just my saying that now makes it an internal challenge for us, but if we say it, then maybe we'll get there. The full board also, interestingly, when it comes to making any sort of investment where there is a trade-off between the actual financial return, and which the finance committee is very happy to sign off on, and a grant-like aspect or some sort of compromise to returns in pursuit of impact, then that grant-like bit would need to get signed off, I think, appropriately by the full board. So they do get engaged. Prioritising mission is, for us, the absolute driver of this whole conversation, that everything ultimately about why the foundation exists should be our charitable purpose. And the endowment that we have exists to fulfill that, and everything falls out from that. So I think that we absolutely agree with, and that drives us. Engagement is our mechanism of choice to be better at what we do at the moment. And the more you look at it, the harder it is to do well, particularly when we, and I suspect most people, don't actually do direct investing. We don't own any stocks directly. I know, Danielle, for example, I think you do deliberately own stocks directly in order to have a voice at relevant meetings. I'd love to be given that mandate, actually. We may get that, but we are at least one stage removed, because we can only engage with our fund managers, and we have to find ways to encourage them to engage on our behalf. And they are not charities, and they have to, they have their own businesses to run. So that is quite hard to do in practice. It's also very interesting to consider in depth when engagement can actually work and there are notable successes, and when, frankly, it doesn't show any sign of doing that. And then you have to start to think whether it's a really valuable tool at all. Transparency and scrutiny is going to be a challenge for us, but I think it's a very helpful challenge. The fact that we've said to ourselves that we want to write something on paper that we expect the world to see has really focused attention on what precisely we mean by this or that, and it's improved the quality of the debate. A variety of views. I think we can learn, and I think that this paper will encourage us to reach out more widely than we have done hitherto to inform everything that we do. We have, as I said, ploughed our own furrow rather to date, and to some extent we could have helped ourselves by listening more carefully to what other people were doing. The review of the time horizon, that is something that we do. In fact, we moved from perpetuity a few years back to being in the long term, and hopefully our new policy is going to make it a formal thing that we review our time horizon quite regularly. And seeking to positively influence others, well, that we're going to have to work on. We are quite a quiet organisation, I think it's fair to say. You don't often see us standing up, and we would like to be better at that. I think if we've done the work well, we would like to use it not just for our own purposes, but to be a part of this whole momentum of pulling all foundations to be the best that they can be. There's where we're at. Happy to amplify any of those things if anyone has questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Matthew. So that brings us to the Q&A, and I'm pleased to say the questions have started flooding in, so that's fantastic. We will get to as many questions as we can. If some of them need to be taken offline and answered afterwards, then we will endeavour to do that as well. And you can, of course, email myself or Rachel with further questions that you come up with. So we've got some big questions out there around diversity, around fossil fuels, around the main barriers and so on. So we'll try to get to all of them. If we start with fossil fuels, just to pick a big meaty topic, one of the questions we had was, is fossil fuel investment legitimate for any foundation given the climate emergency? So maybe Danielle, if I give that question to you first and then to Matthew.
Yes, I mean, it's a really big question, particularly, I suppose, in the context of Hewlett was particularly interesting, and they had a very interesting answer. They're very thoughtful, but the view is because their endowment is so big, it's almost the question, the issue that many of us grapple with, which is divest, invest. It was the invest bit which held them up. So they were sort of saying, well, if we took all, say, I don't know what their holdings are, but say they were holding, a couple of billion in fossil fuels. And its question is, they wanted to put it into something positive, but it was actually very hard to find the investment which would do that, which wouldn't actually just take it out of producing any kind of income at all. So they were just sort of very aware of the implications of moving a very large endowment away from fossil fuels. That's their rationale. I mean, from our position as a foundation, I would say that I can't see justification for it. It is an existential risk. We are set up for the public good. It is very hard to see how a very poor investment in terms of essentially the health of the world could be held by a foundation. However, I understand that is certainly a position that many foundations find themselves. I think at the heart of it comes to the question, are you comfortable? Do you know you're holding fossil fuels, and are you comfortable with those holdings? And are you feeling responsive and accountable to your beneficiaries for holding those investments? So if the answer to all that is we are completely comfortable, then I think you've thought about it. I personally find that very difficult, but I understand that people have to answer that question for themselves.
Great, thanks Danielle. And Matthew, same question to you quickly. Is fossil fuel investment legitimate for any foundation given the climate emergency?
So my personal view is probably not, just to put that on the table, because we all have our own biases. But why is it not? So from the foundation's perspective, I think it's quite important to say that we delegate the day-to-day management to our fund managers. And I know we are invested in fossil fuels right now. Not hugely, and we are gradually trying to shift who we invest through in a way that will probably remove it. But thus far, we've not taken the view that our job is to tell them what to invest in and what not to invest in, as I say, other than tobacco. But we sort of hope that if they get the message right, they will view fossil fuels as far too much of a risk to be good investing. And that we end up in a position where we're not invested in them, not because we told them not to invest in it, but because they've realized it for themselves. And I think where we're at the moment is that we're realizing that the way we try to articulate that so far has not resulted in the right answer. And so shame on us a bit, because we've got to get better at our sort of engaging with our managers to get them to understand the message that we're trying to deliver better. So that's a part of the answer. The other part is, I would say it can be legitimate if you had to burn every hydrocarbon currently underground, and at the end of that process, you'd use the energy released to deliver to the world and to all future generations a truly renewable energy system, then maybe that's worth doing, which is a long-winded way of saying if the oil majors are part of the process of change to a sustainable energy system for the planet, then you would argue that it's legitimate. The reason my own view differs from that right now is I think we've tried that, and we've tried that for years, and it's absolutely clear that the vast bulk of the oil majors have no intention of being part of that solution because they can't move that fast. And the climate emergency is here and now, and we don't have the time left for engagement to work.
Great, thanks Matthew. The next question we've got coming through is that Pillar 3 came out as being the most resonating pillar, which was around engaging with and holding to account those managing your investments. And we've had a few questions come through about what does that actually look like, what does best practice look like, and what are some ways you can do that to hold your investment managers to account. Danielle, if I put that to you first.
I think that's a great question. I think I would say sort of three things in terms of holding people to account, or how we might do that. And these came up in our discussions. I mean, one option and one approach is to resource it. I mean, one of the things we were struck by is amongst our working group, there were so few staff and foundations who are focused on investment work. And this is mainstream investment, not social investment. So just thinking about, that side of the business is, and I don't know how many members of staff Matthew has, but it is like very, compared to the grant side, it is very under-resourced. So, and also if you think about that staffing, but also governance time. And I think people quite often talk about trustee time, and trustees don't have the time to think about it. But we think, if we look at the bulk of we spent sort of 90% of our time talking about 10% of our expenditure, or actually our assets. We were talking about grants a lot of the time. And trustees felt the need to rebalance their time in terms of the actual resources that were held. So I think thinking about the resourcing, be that governance or staffing, is really important. The second thing is to actually know your holdings. I think many foundations, and you can just ask to know what are you holding. You know, just knowing and having an awareness and a comfort with those companies that you think, okay, these are our top 10, top 20, top 30 holdings, and you know, these look like the sort of things I would hope to see in a charity portfolio. I think that also starts to a kind of ball rolling in terms of your relationship with your managers. And the third thing is actually pushing that even a bit further, is actually transparency with the public about what you're holding. So one of the things we undertook as a working group was to, in our annual reports, to start thinking about publishing our holdings. We publish our grants. Why don't we publish our holdings? And if we're comfortable with them, then we're happy putting it in our annual report. So I think it starts, our own responsibility relating to our managers is the kind of beginning of the key to that discussion.
Great, thanks Danielle. And just to expand that a bit further, coming to you, Matthew, one of the questions we'd had come through is, how can investment transparency empower grantees? How does that relationship work between grantees and the wider stakeholders in terms of what the foundation is funding versus the investment and what is essentially generating those returns? And it'd be good to hear from you, Matthew, at your stage of the journey about what investment transparency might be looking like for the John Ellerman Foundation, if you've done thinking around your wider stakeholders and in terms of what investment transparency means there.
Yes, fine. That takes it off into a slightly different angle, but I'll try to address that. And I'm not the grants expert, but we are increasingly conscious of the fact that we've always felt, I think, that it's a one-way street. We're the people with the money, and we give money to other people, and they're very grateful for it. And that's how the world lies. And that is changing. And I think there have been some notable examples of grantees who've turned around to funders and have said, no, thank you. Your money's not good enough. And that's quite a shock to someone like us. You know, we're the good guys, aren't we? That's what we expect. But actually, it's fair enough. And I think we need to show that, certainly to some sorts of potential grantees, that the money is coming from somewhere which doesn't cause a problem for them. You know, and there are examples of types of sources of money that cause problems for people, quite rightly. So this is very new territory for us, but we're aware of it. And what we want to do is to ensure that we are slightly ahead of that curve, so that if anybody wants to ask that very pertinent question, we are not embarrassed by the answer. So for us, one thing is we have no idea where the money really comes from, our money. Yes, the John Ellerman built a massive shipping empire based in Hull around the turn of the last century. And we hope, but that's all we really know about it. So we are delving a bit into our own history to make sure that there's nothing hiding in our closet that might hit the Daily Mail before it hits our trustees. So, you know, that is one angle. And I think the whole sector needs to start thinking about it in that reverse way. You know, how do we know, just because we're giving money, that's our superpower, as somebody said, how do we know that we're the good guys? So a bit of self-reflection on that is important. And then that's way back in history, but then now we actually do stuff now. Our investing is what we do now, with the 95% of our value that we don't spend in each year. And so we'd better be doing the best we can with that, driven by our charitable purpose, your pillar number 2. And we're starting to do that. Now, we know that we have masses to learn on engagement, which was sort of the big topic, from the likes of Danielle and her team, who really do in our sector sort of lead the charge in terms of what good engagement looks like. And we're learning how to do that. We're not yet good enough at it. And I've seen a number of people commenting that we can engage even though we don't directly own stocks. And I fully take that on board. This is part of what we're getting better at. And we are using some of the sort of help around the likes of Share Action and particularly CRIN, Charities Responsible Investment Network, who have provided us with helpful tools to make our conversations with our fund managers that much smarter in terms of engagement.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. And keeping with the topic of engagement there, because that's come up in a few of the questions here, you mentioned CRIN and Share Action, which obviously we can share resources on those. We have had a couple of questions come through about smaller foundations and what support ACF might be able to provide. And we will be running an increasing number of sessions around investment. We are conscious at ACF that, similar to a lot of foundations, there has been a lot of focus historically on grant making, and that actually more peer learning, more opportunities for small foundations to share their practice, for different types of foundations to share practice, would be really valuable. So I would say keep an eye out for some of those sessions coming forward. But in terms of shareholder engagement, and there's obviously, as we detail in the report, there are different elements to that, because there's the engagement that your investment managers will be doing and then direct engagement yourselves. Danielle, if you could talk just a little bit about what your experience have been in terms of shareholder engagement.
Yes, I mean, we do have, I suppose, it goes back to the strategy, which is taking forward the themes of this report, in that trustees sort of went back almost to, how do we define ourselves? Why would we call ourselves a grant maker when that is in fact our marginal spend? That is a part of what we do, but actually that's not most of our assets and our resources. So we actually started calling ourselves a capitalized charity, meaning we need to look at our impact across all of our capital base. So we start from that kind of strategic repositioning. Engagement was just an obvious development of that, in that if we actually have assets that are in the market and in the capital markets, then we need to work out how we can influence the use of that capital and where it's going and the companies we're invested in. So we actually have someone called, as does Kelly Chase Foundation, a engagement manager, investment engagement manager, and we take an active role in taking that forward. That is a particular kind of model, but there are so many other models. There is social media. So again, if you know your holdings, you can actually engage in social media, you can actually write letters, and we've joined the Charities Responsible Investment Network and take an active part in kinds of engagements on that side. So there are lots of different ways depending on your resources. And I think in the working group, there are lots of different approaches to it. So I think, as many foundations as there are different ways of engaging. And I think the question is, you should start. It's sort of like that Nike advert, other trainers are available, but just do it, just try, just engage, and just think, well, what can I do if I know I don't like what we're invested in, for instance, Boohoo, and we know that they're doing a particular thing in Leicester. I'm not comfortable with that. We're a Leicester-based foundation. What can you do? What can you engage with? Who do you know? How can you take that forward? And I think that's the central place to start.
Brilliant. And then Matthew, just coming to you, we've had a couple of questions and you have touched on this already. But just some more insight into what the main barriers have been for you in terms of trying to put this out there, and how you've met some of those barriers, maybe one or two of the key ones in terms of trying to change your practice.
Okay, I'll sort of get into that by picking up the other thing on engagement that I think is potentially a huge opportunity. We're privileged to be in a sector where we aren't competing against each other and beating each other up commercially. And that's the sort of world that I came from, which means we can work together. And engagement that's collaborative engagement seems to me to be just to amplify hugely the potential results. And that is one. Barrier is not quite the right term, but we at John Ellerman have tended to do our own thing by and large, and I think we can learn to do an awful lot more by engaging in some of the collaborative action, which ACF and Share Action and others, or just groups that form themselves to do really good stuff, like Friends Provident with that ESG Olympics process, which, as you know, was just brilliant as a process to get things moving. That we hadn't prepared that. Danielle didn't know I was going to say that, but I really did think that that was impressive, and it got a good conversation going within our organisation, and that was really collaborative in that everyone was allowed to see what was happening. So that's something where this sector can be particularly good at and particularly powerful at. We, I know, don't do enough of that, and we're trying to learn how to do that better. Other barriers are, I've mentioned how, like a lot of people, we've struggled on the exclusions front, not because we have some deep philosophical antipathy to exclusions. It is that when you get into them in detail, what are you actually excluding? So take hydrocarbons. If you start by simply saying, we don't want to burn hydrocarbons that don't need to be burnt, then you know you can divest from oil majors. But what of the auto sector? What of airlines? What of the consumers of hydrocarbon fuels? So it's that type of conversation which has, you know, that's been a bit of a barrier to having more exclusions. And on engagement, it is about the time it takes to learn best practice. That is time consuming. Danielle mentioned about staffing. You're looking at our total staff engaged in this area. So yeah, it is time consuming. I think, you know, I for one want to learn how to do this better. And I think there are huge opportunities there, but that gives you a sort of flavor. The points of principle are quite easy to win. Then you look into what it means in practice, and the gnarly detail can be quite nuanced and quite tricky.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. We've got lots and lots of questions still coming through, which I think shows us that we need to hold another ACF session or multiple sessions on this, which we will be doing. So for those who've asked questions about the Charity Commission, about ESG ratings, we are going to come to all of those. We are going to bring those up in future ACF sessions. But we do only have about 1 minute left today. So Danielle, I'm just going to give the last question to you. And this again has come up in the report around diversity in investment management firms, diversity of thought, the Black Lives Matter movement, sources of money, and so on. Could you just talk to us for we've got about 1 minute left on diversity and investment managers and looking at all of that?
I think it goes back to the sort of early question about engaging with who and holding an account to who's managing your money. I think it's talking to them about their policies and who actually is doing the investing. We've also found a range of things. There's a good literature. I have to say most of it tends to be American, but about race in the investment industry, and about really kind of quite deep psychological issues around how people feel comfortable who's managing their money. I think these sorts of issues need to be addressed and looked at and talked about openly. The best example in the UK has actually been on gender, where the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust actually pulled together all of their managers and was very curious as to why men were the ones turning up to the meetings. I think looking very carefully at that, and asking questions, found that in fact women were very involved. It was just actually who was perceived to be acceptable to be shown to the client. So there's some things which really need to be looked at, and I think as charities we are in a perfect position to be asking those questions, and it is incumbent upon us to do so, I would say. And I think also then looking at the natural nature of the holdings as well, again, going back to knowing what's in your portfolio and knowing what the policies of those boards are. And make sure that those boards are reflecting society and the customer bases that they should be. So I think those are all very deep questions, and I feel if it's important to use strategically, and I think it needs to be, these are the nature of the questions that need to be asked. I mean, we're taking a paper to our IC, our next meeting, to talk about, what are the dimensions that we feel fit with our strategy of this question. And I think this is the nature of the discussions that need to be happening.
Brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. And a huge thank you to you and Matthew for answering questions that I think we could have had an hour-long session on each of those questions. And for those of you on there, we're going to put up our last poll of the day very quickly here. I'm conscious that we're 2 minutes over. So this one's just asking about actions that you might take following today's webinar. You can select as many as apply to you. So exploring the report with your board, analysing current practice, engaging with your investment managers, reviewing transparency, seeking out a variety of research and views. So I'll just give that a moment. Here we go, we're just getting the last few in. Brilliant, so I'll end the polling there. So we're really seeing very strongly people wanting to explore it with their board, to analyse their current practice and to engage more deeply with their investment managers, and also some interest in exploring transparency. There's also some answering other, so we would love to hear more about what you are thinking about in that other column. It just leaves for me to say there will be a post-webinar survey. It will pop straight up on your screen after this. Please do take 5 minutes before you go off to have your sandwiches just to fill it in, because all the feedback you give us is great, and we'll also look through all of the chat and all of the questions that have been asked and share those round. Finally, just a huge thank you to Danielle and to Matthew for joining us today and for answering all the questions, and to all the members of the Investment Working Group, many of whom were on this call. Thank you for your input, your encouragement and your challenge over the last 18 months. And thank you to all of you for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you at future ACF events.